We're going to be talking about carbohydrates, but I want to start out by just showing you how I like to organize this material and how how I've learned it and memorized it. So I think this really lends itself really well to this idea of a concept map or a hierarchy chart, which is to take big categories and progressively break them out into smaller categories. So earlier I said that there's 4 major groups of macromolecules. So I have my big category of macromolecules. I'm going to be talking here about carbohydrates. We also have proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. So what I do is for each of these, I break them into progressively smaller groups. So carbohydrates, for example, is this broad category of molecules built of sugars made out of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, but they include 3 different categories: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So without knowing very much about carbohydrates yet, you might realize that mono means 1, di means 2, and poly means many. Saccharide, maybe you catch that sort of sounds like sugar, saccharide, sugar. So it comes from the same root. So this really means 1 sugar, 2 sugars, or many sugars. And this makes sense because carbohydrates are polymers. So a monosaccharide is the monomer form. A disaccharide is 2 monomers hooked together into a short polymer. And polysaccharides are many monomers hooked together into a large polymer. Monosaccharides are also called simple sugars. So again, they're the monomer form of carbohydrates. We're going to focus on a couple of examples, sorry about that, over the course of the semester. We're going to see deoxyribose and ribose, and these are sugars that are present in DNA and RNA. And the other sugar we're going to study a lot is glucose. This is the structure of glucose, and this is how we're going to see it represented in our textbook from here on out. This is another way to show glucose, and if you've taken a class before, maybe you've seen it this way. But this is the way that it is in biology, and so that's why we're going to see it this way. This is an isomer. It's the alpha D glucose form. So this is referring to a geometric isomer and an enantiomer. And so only this particular form of glucose is available for biological organisms or for living things. Disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides bonded together by a glycosidic bond. So as we're studying these polymers, you should always be tracking what kind of bond goes between them. So I have 1 sugar, I have a second sugar, and the bond between them is always a glycosidic bond. And again, notice glyco sounds like glucose, so that's referring to glucose or reminding you that it's a carbohydrate bond. These are joined by dehydration or condensation reactions and broken apart by hydrolysis reactions. So remember, this is true for all polymers. Examples of disaccharides include sucrose, maltose, and lactose. Sucrose is the one you're probably most familiar with. It's a disaccharide of a glucose bonded to a fructose. So here's the glucose, here's the fructose, and this is the glycosidic bond. Sucrose is table sugar, so that's why you're probably familiar with it. Maltose is another disaccharide. You're probably familiar with it in the form of malt extract. So that particular different distinct flavor of malt extract, like in malted milk balls, is the maltose sugar. Lactose is another one most people have heard of. This is also called milk sugar. Lactose is, again, a disaccharide, and it has that glycosidic bond between it. So when somebody is lactose intolerant, it means they can't break this bond. So if you are not lactose intolerant, if you're able to digest milk, when you eat lactose, It goes into your digestive system, and that bond gets broken, and the two sugars are released. If you're lactose intolerant, that bond can't be broken, so it goes through your digestive system stuck together, and this stuck together sugar, when it makes its way to your intestines, gives you really unpleasant symptoms that are associated with lactose intolerance. So the gas and bloating is because lactose intolerant people can't break this down. This is a specific enzyme coded for in your DNA, so some people just don't have the ability to do it. This is actually probably the sort of default setting for us. This is how all humans originally were, because just like most other mammals, you only eat milk when you're a baby. But humans basically figured out how to get other animals to give us milk, and so that's why we started eating milk when we were adults. And in order to do that, we had to evolve the ability to do this in adulthood. So again, this is very rare in the natural world for an adult. All mammalian babies can do it. Okay, the last type of carbohydrate is polysaccharides, and again, poly means many. So these are many monosaccharides linked together to form a large polymer. These have two distinct purposes in organisms. They can store energy. So starch is the way that plants can store energy. So you probably know that a potato is rich in starch. A potato is in the ground, it's the root of the plant, and it's storing energy for the plant so that it can grow in the spring. Animals also have a carbohydrate storage molecule. It's called glycogen. Maybe you've heard of glycogen because it's important in exercise physiology. Glycogen is a short-term energy molecule for us. So it's particularly rich in places that are frequently and constantly using lots of energy, like the brain and the liver and muscles. Oops. Okay. But again, it's short-term energy storage. In animals, we typically have long-term energy storage as fat, because fat is a more condensed or compact way to store energy. And when you move, because you're an animal, not a plant, you want your energy to be stored in a more compact form. Carbohydrates or polysaccharides can also serve a structural function. Cellulose is another type of polysaccharide. Cellulose is the primary component of wood, stems, etc. in plants, and so these are providing primarily structural functions. Another type of polysaccharide is chitin. Chitin is present in insects, and so you may know that insects don't have like a bony skeleton like we have. They have an exoskeleton, and that exoskeleton is made of chitin. I always say it's the crunch when you step on a bug is the chitin. We also have some structural polysaccharides. They're called glycosaminoglycans, kind of a mouthful. You probably know of one or have heard of it, glucosamine. It's a popular dietary supplement for joint health, and that kind of gives you a clue to what these do in animals. They provide cushioning and structural support in our joints. An interesting thing about these different types of polysaccharides, so still talking here about polysaccharides. I'll write this here. Is that all three of these, so we're talking about glycogen, starch, and cellulose, are all made of the exact same thing, glucose. So if I look at the structure, here's starch. There's a glucose, 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 and it's a huge, long molecule of glucose. So is glycogen. Glucose, 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 glucose. The difference is in the amount of branching. So notice that this is 2 and then a branch, 2 and then a branch. And so glycogen has a lot of branching. Starch, on the other hand, tends to have less branching. So notice in this image, there's only 1 branch point here, whereas glycogen had 2 branch points. So starch has less branching. If you think about the space it takes up, this makes it take up more space, Having more branches makes it take up less space. And again, this makes sense because in animals, they have to move, so they want to make it more compact to facilitate movement. Cellulose is the other polysaccharide here that is also made of glucose. So here's a glucose, 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 glucose. The key difference between the cellulose and glycogen and starch is actually here, and you can hardly see it, but this is the glycosidic bond. There's an oxygen here. And this is, notice that I have it pointing up here in cellulose. In glycogen, that bond points down. So it also points down in starch. So this is the bond that I'm talking about. It's here and here. In starch and glycogen, that bond is shaped like this. It's like a V. In cellulose, it's more like a mountain. And so that is an important shape difference. You and me have the ability to digest starch and glycogen because we can break the V bond that's presented here. So if you eat a potato, you're able to break down the starch into sugars. Your body is able to take glycogen and break it down into sugars. If you eat cellulose, your body can't break the mountain bond. So again, a different shape, it can't break it. So cellulose is undigestible for us. From a nutritional perspective, this is sometimes called roughage or insoluble fiber. Means we can't digest it. It's still important for you to eat some, but you can't break it down for energy. The interesting thing about this is that some organisms can break down cellulose for energy. Cows, for example, and related ruminants are going to eat grass, and grass is very high in cellulose, very low in starch, and they're able to break down this cellulose. Well, they're actually like us in that they can't do it themselves. But cows have bacteria that live in their stomachs, and those bacteria can break down cellulose. So you may have heard about the many stomachs of cows, and it's really because they have to have that system because they have many different bacteria that are helping them break down the cellulose in the grass when they eat grass. And so that's polysaccharides. So again, we've finished talking about carbohydrates, which we have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides.